What happens when a man who has faced death in the darkest corners of the world finds himself surrounded by cocky recruits who think they know what real strength looks like? Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't need to roar to prove its power. Marcus Chen had killed men with his bare hands in places that didn't exist on any map. He had survived hell weeks that would break most humans, endured torture that would make grown men cry for their mothers, and completed missions that governments would never acknowledge. But none of that mattered to the 20-something recruits at the private military training facility where he now worked as an instructor. To them, he was just another washed-up veteran trying to relive his glory days. A quiet Asian man in his 40s who spoke softly and kept to himself. They saw his calm demeanor as weakness, his silence as fear, and his reluctance to engage in their juvenile posturing as proof that he was all talk and no action. They were about to learn why the most dangerous snakes don't rattle before they strike. Marcus Chen stood at the edge of the training ground, watching the new batch of recruits stumble through basic combat drills. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt field of Blackwater Elite Training Facility, a private military contractor school nestled in the mountains of Colorado. At 42, Marcus possessed the kind of stillness that came from years of moving through enemy territory where a misplaced step could mean death. The recruits called him the librarian behind his back. It wasn't meant as a compliment. With his wire-rimmed glasses, soft-spoken manner, and preference for reading tactical manuals during lunch breaks, Marcus didn't fit their image of what a military instructor should look like. They expected someone who screamed orders, flexed muscles, and regaled them with war stories over beers. Instead, they got a quiet man who demonstrated techniques with precise, economical movements and spoke in measured tones that barely carried across the training yard. "Chen's past his prime," whispered Jake Morrison, a 24-year-old former Army Ranger with more tattoos than common sense. He was executing knife-fighting techniques with exaggerated flourishes, clearly performing for his audience rather than focusing on proper form. Guy probably spent his whole service career behind a desk, Morrison's crew laughed on cue. They were the self-appointed alpha dogs of the program. 5 recruits who had bonded over their shared belief that they were destined for greatness in the private military world. There was Tommy Tank Rodriguez, a massive former Marine who could bench press a small car but thought strategy was something other people worried about. Next came the Wilson twins, Derek and David, former Special Forces operators who finished each other's sentences and each other's fights. Finally, there was Kevin, Psycho Brennan, a wiry ex-Navy corpsman whose nickname came from his unsettling habit of smiling during the most intense training scenarios. They had arrived at Blackwater Elite 6 weeks ago with impressive military records and even more impressive egos. The facility was known for producing the cream of the crop in private military contractors, soldiers who would go on to earn 6-figure salaries protecting high-value targets or conducting covert operations in places where official military forces couldn't operate. Competition was fierce, and washing out meant going back to civilian life or settling for less prestigious security work. Marcus had been assigned as their advanced combat instructor, responsible for teaching them the kind of close-quarters fighting techniques that could mean the difference between completing a mission and coming home in a body bag. But from day one, the group had made it clear they thought they knew better. "Check this out," Morrison said, spinning his training knife in an elaborate pattern before snapping it into a reverse grip. "This is how we did it in Kandahar. Quick, efficient, deadly." Marcus watched the display with the patient expression of someone who had seen everything at least twice. The knife work was flashy but fundamentally flawed, all style and no substance. In a real fight, Morrison's elaborate grip changes would get him killed before he could land a single strike. But Marcus had learned not to correct them immediately. These particular recruits had a habit of dismissing his feedback as outdated theory from someone who had never seen real action. "Not bad," Marcus said quietly, stepping forward. "Why is it? Mind if I show you a small adjustment that might help?" Morrison's eyes flashed with irritation. "I think I've got it handled, Professor. This isn't my first rodeo." The Professor. Another of their nicknames for him. Marcus nodded and stepped back, making a note in his mental file. Morrison was the ringleader, the one who set the tone for the others. Deal with him and the rest would follow. But timing was everything. Push too hard too fast and they would simply dig in their heels deeper. The truth was, Marcus understood these men better than they understood themselves. He had been young and arrogant once too, fresh out of SEAL training and convinced that his Bud/S instructors were relics from a bygone era. It had taken getting shot in a Mogadishu alley to realize that experience and humility were the only things that kept you alive when the bullets started flying. Marcus had spent 15 years with Naval Special Warfare Group 1, conducting operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and half a dozen other countries that appeared in classified reports but never made the evening news. He had been part of direct action missions that eliminated high-value targets, reconnaissance operations that lasted weeks in enemy territory, and hostage rescues that saved lives and prevented international incidents. His service record included 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a Navy Cross that he never talked about because the mission it commemorated had never officially happened. He had trained with the SAS in Britain, cross-trained with Israeli commandos in the Negev Desert, and spent 6 months embedded with German GSG 9 learning urban warfare techniques that weren't taught in any American military school. But the recruits didn't know any of this. Marcus's personnel file at Blackwater Elite contained only the basic facts: former Navy SEAL, honorable discharge, security clearance inactive, specialized in close-quarters combat and tactical instruction. The details of his service remained classified, and Marcus preferred it that way. He had no interest in trading war stories or trying to impress young soldiers with tales of past glory. "All right, let's move on to scenario training," Marcus announced, consulting the schedule on his tablet. "We're going to practice building clearance. Morrison, your team leader. Pick 3 others and plan your entry." Morrison grinned and immediately chose his usual crew: Rodriguez, Derek Wilson, and Brennan. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, and occasionally glancing at Marcus with barely concealed smirks. Marcus knew they were planning something. These 5 had been pushing boundaries for weeks, testing him to see how far they could go before he snapped. The training building was a 2-story structure designed to simulate everything from office buildings to residential homes. It could be reconfigured with movable walls and furniture to create an endless variety of scenarios. Today's setup was relatively simple: 4 rooms on the ground floor, a staircase leading to 3 rooms upstairs, and multiple entry points. "Standard breaching protocol," Marcus explained, as he handed out training weapons loaded with simunition rounds that would sting but not seriously injure. "Threat assessment, room clearing, threat neutralization. I'll be playing the role of hostile forces." Tank Rodriguez snorted. "One guy? This is going to be too easy. Maybe we should give the professor a handicap," Morrison suggested with false concern. Hate to embarrass him in front of the other recruits. A small crowd had gathered to watch, drawn by the prospect of seeing the quiet instructor finally get his comeuppance. Word had spread through the facility about the brewing tension between Marcus and Morrison's crew. Some of the other recruits had tried to warn Morrison that underestimating any instructor at Blackwater Elite was a mistake, but their warnings had fallen on deaf ears. Marcus simply nodded and headed into the building to take his position. He moved through the rooms with fluid efficiency, checking sightlines and cover positions. His mind automatically catalogued entry points, choke points, and tactical advantages. This was where he felt most at home, in the space between planning and action, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. Outside, Morrison was briefing his team with the confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. "Standard 4-man entry. Tank, you're the breacher. Derek, you take point. Psycho, you're covering our 6. I'll direct traffic and call targets." "What about the other guys?" Derek asked, nodding toward his twin brother David and the handful of recruits who were watching from the sidelines. "They can watch and learn," Morrison said loudly enough for Marcus to hear through the thin walls. "Should be over pretty quick anyway." Marcus smiled to himself as he settled into position behind an overturned desk in what appeared to be an office. These recruits were about to receive the kind of education that no classroom could provide. He had spent years perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare, fighting smarter rather than harder, using environment and psychology as weapons just as deadly as guns or knives. The building went silent except for the distant murmur of conversation from the observers outside. Marcus controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate and sharpening his focus. This was the space he knew best, the moment before violence, when time seemed to stretch and every sense became hypertuned to the smallest detail. Outside, Morrison raised his hand and began counting down from 5. His team stacked up beside the main entrance, weapons ready, confidence radiating from their posture. They had trained for scenarios like this dozens of times. 4 highly trained operators against 1 aging instructor in a controlled environment. The odds were heavily in their favor. Morrison's hand closed into a fist, and Rodriguez kicked in the door with enough force to splinter the frame. They poured through the entrance with textbook precision, weapons sweeping their assigned sectors, communication crisp and professional. The first room was clear, so was the second. The third room contained nothing but furniture and shadows. As they approached the 4th room where Marcus was waiting, Morrison felt a flicker of unease. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Marcus heard them coming long before they reached his position. Their breathing was too loud, their footsteps too heavy, their equipment creaking with every movement. He could track their progress by sound alone, predicting their route through the building with the accuracy of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before. The first lesson he was about to teach them was simple. In close quarters combat, the loudest person usually dies first. When Morrison's team finally breached the office where Marcus was waiting, they found nothing but an empty room and an open window. Outside, they could hear the other recruits laughing and pointing. Marcus had disappeared like smoke, leaving behind only a training manual open to a page titled The Art of Misdirection. Morrison's face flushed red as he realized they had been outmaneuvered by a man they had dismissed as a washed-up academic. But this was only the beginning. Marcus Chen was about to show them the difference between playing soldier and being one. The simunition round hit Derek Wilson square in the chest before he even realized he was in someone's crosshairs. The impact sent a sharp sting through his tactical vest and painted a bright red mark that would be visible for days. He spun around, weapon raised, trying to identify the source of the shot, but found only empty corridor. "Contact front!" he shouted, but his voice echoed off empty walls. Morrison's team had regrouped in the main hallway after discovering Marcus's disappearing act from the office. Their textbook formation was tight, professional, and completely predictable to someone who had spent years studying how American military units moved through hostile territory. Marcus had simply positioned himself in the building's dead space, areas that were outside their field of view but within striking distance. The second shot took out Kevin Brennan, catching him in the shoulder as he tried to cover the stairwell. The simunition round's impact spun him around and sent his weapon clattering across the floor. Brennan's usual unsettling grin had been replaced by genuine surprise and growing anger. "Where the hell is he?" Rodriguez bellowed, his massive frame filling the hallway as he swept his weapon back and forth. "This is bullshit. He's cheating." Marcus materialized from what had appeared to be solid wall, a maintenance panel that he had quietly opened and concealed himself behind while the team was breaching other rooms. He was close enough to reach out and touch Rodriguez, close enough that the big man's weapon was useless. Before Rodriguez could react, Marcus had stripped the weapon from his hands, with a fluid motion that looked more like a magic trick than a combat technique. "Threat neutralized," Marcus said quietly, pressing the muzzle of Rodriguez's own weapon against his neck. "You're dead. Son of a bitch." Rodriguez started to turn, muscles bunching for what would have been a devastating counterattack, but Marcus was no longer there. He had melted back into the building's shadows, leaving Rodriguez standing alone with growing red welt on his throat, where the weapon's muzzle had pressed against his skin. Outside, the crowd of watching recruits had gone silent. What had started as entertainment, watching the quiet instructor get humiliated by Morrison's crew, had become something else entirely. The four men who had entered the building with such confidence were being systematically dismantled by someone they couldn't even see clearly, let alone engage effectively. Morrison was alone now, his entire team eliminated in less than 3 minutes. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his weapon, eyes darting between shadows and doorways that might conceal his tormentor. The building had become a maze of potential threats, every corner a place where death might be waiting. "Come out and fight like a man," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking slightly with frustration and growing fear. "Stop hiding like a coward." The response came not as words, but as action. Marcus appeared at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against the bright light streaming through an upper window. But by the time Morrison raised his weapon to engage, Marcus was already moving. He came down the stairs not by running or jumping, but by flowing like water, using the handrail and walls to control his descent in a way that made targeting him nearly impossible. Morrison got off 3 shots, all of them missing by inches as Marcus seemed to bend and weave around the projectiles. Before Morrison could fire a 4th round, Marcus was inside his reach, and the engagement became personal. The weapon was gone from Morrison's hands so quickly that he barely registered losing it. Then he was on the ground, Marcus's knee pressed against his chest, a training knife held steady against his throat. "You're dead," Marcus said in the same quiet tone he used for classroom instruction. "Your entire team is dead. Mission failed." Morrison stared up at the man he had dismissed as a washed-up professor. This close he could see details he had missed before, the small scar running along Marcus's jawline. The way his eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing and cataloging threats. The controlled breathing that suggested someone in perfect physical condition despite his unassuming appearance. "How?" Morrison gasped, genuinely confused. "We had the numbers. We had the training. We did everything by the book. Marcus helped him to his feet with the same fluid efficiency he had shown throughout the engagement. That's exactly the problem. You did everything by the book. Your book. The problem with fighting by the book is that everyone else has read the same book. The eliminated team members emerged from various parts of the building, red welts marking where they had been killed by Marcus's simunition rounds. Their expressions ranged from embarrassment to anger to grudging respect. Rodriguez was rubbing his throat and muttering under his breath. The Wilson twins were exchanging looks that suggested their confidence had taken a serious hit. Brennan had stopped smiling altogether. Outside, the Watchy recruits parted as Marcus led Morrison's team back to the assembly area. Word of what had happened was already spreading through the facility. The quiet instructor had just dismantled 4 experienced operators without breaking a sweat, and he had done it while barely making a sound. "Gather round," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the training ground despite its softness. "Let's talk about what just happened." The crowd of recruits formed a rough circle, with Morrison's crew standing slightly apart from the others. Their body language spoke of wounded pride and defensive anger, but also of grudging curiosity. They had just experienced something that contradicted everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. "First question," Marcus continued, removing his glasses and cleaning them with deliberate care. "What did this team do wrong?" Several hands went up, but Marcus nodded toward Morrison. "Team leader calls it." Morrison's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "We underestimated the threat." "True, but incomplete. Anyone else?" A recruit named Sarah Martinez, a former Air Force Security Forces member who had been watching from the sidelines, raised her hand. "They moved too predictably. Standard formation, standard tactics. You knew exactly what they were going to do before they did it." "Better," Marcus nodded. "What else?" "They were too loud," offered another recruit. "I could hear them coming from outside the building. They assumed numerical superiority meant tactical superiority," added someone from the back of the crowd. Marcus listened to each response, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions. Slowly, he was building a case study in real time, using Morrison's team's failure as a teaching moment for the entire group. It was a masterful display of instruction, turning humiliation into education. "All good points," Marcus said finally, "but you're missing the fundamental issue. This team failed because they were fighting the wrong war." He walked over to a whiteboard mounted on a nearby post and began sketching a simple diagram. They came in expecting a direct engagement, 4 operators with superior firepower and training against one opponent in a fixed position. That's the war they prepared for, the war they wanted to fight. The diagram showed a square representing the building with arrows indicating multiple entry points and fields of fire. But that's not the war they got. Instead, they found themselves in an asymmetric engagement where their advantages became disadvantages. Quote, Marcus added new elements to the diagram: escape routes, concealed positions, psychological pressure points. Their numerical superiority meant they had to coordinate and communicate, which made them louder and slower. Their standard tactics meant they were predictable. Their confidence meant they didn't adapt when the situation changed. Morrison was staring at the diagram with growing understanding. "You turned our strengths against us." "Exactly. This is what real combat looks like. Your enemy doesn't line up across a field and wait for you to engage them on your terms. They hit you when you're not ready, where you're not prepared, in ways you didn't expect." Marcus set down the marker and faced the assembled recruits. "Every one of you has impressive military records. You've completed advanced training, served in combat zones, earned commendations. But you've been fighting conventional wars against conventional enemies using conventional tactics."
He gestured toward Morrison's team. "These men are excellent soldiers."
In a straight fight, they would be formidable opponents. But private military contracting isn't about straight fights. It's about protecting clients who are targets, extracting assets from hostile territory, and completing missions where failure means international incidents. The crowd was silent, absorbing the lesson. Marcus could see understanding dawning on some faces, while others still showed skepticism or wounded pride. "So what do we do differently?" Martinez asked. Marcus smiled slightly. "That's the right question. And that's what we're going to spend the next few weeks learning. But first, I want to give Morrison's team a chance to redeem themselves." Morrison looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Same scenario, same building, same objectives. But this time, you get to use anything you learned from this engagement. Think of it as a do-over." Rodriguez stepped forward, his massive frame radiating renewed confidence. "You're on, Professor. But this time, we know what we're dealing with." Marcus nodded and handed Morrison a fresh magazine for his training weapon. 5 minutes to plan. Then we go again. As Morrison's team huddled to discuss new tactics, Marcus walked back toward the building. But this time, several other recruits approached him with questions about the engagement, wanting to understand the techniques he had used. "How did you disappear from that office?" asked one. "The window was a misdirection," Marcus explained. "I never left the room. There's a blind spot behind the door that's invisible unless you physically clear it. Basic room clearing doctrine says to check corners first, but most people get fixated on obvious exit routes. What about those shots you made? Some of those angles seemed impossible." "Geometry and timing," Marcus replied. "If you understand how people move and where they're likely to be, you can predict their positions even when you can't see them directly." Morrison was watching this exchange while his team planned their second assault. He was beginning to understand that Marcus wasn't just a good fighter. He was a teacher who used combat as a language to communicate concepts that couldn't be learned from books or lectures. "Time," Marcus called out, checking his watch. "Ready for round 2? Morrison nodded, but his expression was different now. The cocky arrogance was gone, replaced by focused intensity. His team's posture had changed too. They moved with more deliberate care, spoke in whispers instead of normal conversation tones, and checked their equipment with the kind of attention to detail that came from understanding consequences. "Same rules," Marcus said as he headed back into the building. "But remember, I know that you know what you know now." As the door closed behind him, Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. They had just learned how dangerous Marcus could be when they underestimated him, but now he was telling them that he had been holding back, that the first engagement had been Marcus fighting at a fraction of his actual capability. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Brennan whispered. Morrison checked his weapon one more time and looked at his team. "I guess we're about to find out." The second engagement lasted 47 minutes. Morrison's team had abandoned their textbook approach in favor of patient, methodical tactics that would have made their former instructors proud. They used sound discipline, moved with deliberate care, and cleared each room with the kind of paranoid thoroughness that kept soldiers alive in places like Fallujah and Kandahar. But Marcus had also evolved his approach. Where the first engagement had been a demonstration of basic asymmetric principles, the second became a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't just hide from Morrison's team, he haunted them. A shadow glimpsed in peripheral vision. A sound that might have been footsteps or might have been imagination. Equipment that mysteriously moved when no one was looking. By the 20-minute mark, Morrison's team was showing signs of stress that went beyond normal tactical tension. Rodriguez had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking over his shoulder. Derek Wilson was jumping at sounds that weren't there. Brennan's trademark smile had been replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone whose nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Marcus never fired a shot during the second engagement. He didn't need to. He had weaponized uncertainty itself, turning the building into a psychological maze, where his opponents defeated themselves through mounting paranoia and decision paralysis. When Morrison finally called a halt to the exercise, his team hadn't found Marcus despite 47 minutes of intensive searching. "Where the hell were you?" Rodriguez demanded as Marcus emerged from what appeared to be solid wall for the second time that day. "Everywhere and nowhere," Marcus replied, opening a section of dropped ceiling that revealed a crawl space running the length of the building. Infrastructure is your friend in urban environments. Most people fight in the spaces buildings are designed for. But buildings have other spaces, maintenance areas, utility chases, structural voids. If you know how to access them, you can move through a building like a ghost. The watching recruits were no longer looking at Marcus with skepticism. Word of his performance had spread throughout the facility, drawing instructors and administrative staff who rarely bothered with routine training exercises. Even Colonel James Harrison, the facility's commanding officer, had appeared to observe the proceedings. Harrison was a career special operations veteran who had commanded units in every major conflict of the past 2 decades. He had recruited Marcus personally, drawn by a service record that read like a compilation of classified highlights from the War on Terror. But even Harrison was impressed by the clinical efficiency with which Marcus had dismantled Morrison's team. "Quite a demonstration, Chen," Harrison said as the crowd began to disperse. "Mind if we talk?" Marcus nodded and followed Harrison toward the administrative building, leaving Morrison's team to debrief among themselves. The recruits were arguing in low voices about what they could have done differently, their earlier arrogance replaced by the kind of intense analysis that came from being thoroughly outmatched. Harrison's office was a shrine to military efficiency, decorated with unit patches, commendation certificates, and photos of him with various military and political figures. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant rather than a training facility office. The Morrison crew has been a problem since day one, Harrison said, settling behind his desk. Good soldiers individually, but they've been poisoning the atmosphere with their attitude. Half the other recruits are either intimidated by them or trying to emulate them. Marcus sipped his coffee and waited. He had learned long ago that superior officers often talk themselves into decisions if you gave them enough time and silence. I've been wondering if we should wash them out, Harrison continued. But they're too skilled to lose, and their military records are solid. What's your assessment? They're redeemable, Marcus said, after a moment. The arrogance is mostly defensive. They're scared of being seen as weak or inadequate, so they overcompensate with bravado. Strip away the posturing, and you've got 4 competent operators who could be very good at this work. Morrison especially? Morrison's the key. He's a natural leader, which is why the others follow him. But he's also intelligent enough to learn from today. The question is whether his pride will let him. Harrison nodded and pulled out a thick folder. I want you to take over their advanced training personally. Full immersion tactics, weapons, psychology, everything. Consider it a special project. Marcus opened the folder and scanned the contents. It contained detailed psychological profiles, service records, and assessment reports for all 5 members of Morrison's crew. The picture that emerged was complex, talented individuals whose potential was being limited by interpersonal dynamics and unchecked egos. What's the timeline? 8 weeks until graduation. After that, they either get placement with high-end contracting firms or they wash out and look for work with more security companies. That's not much time to rebuild their foundation, which is why I'm giving you carte blanche. Design whatever training program you think will work. Use any resources you need. But understand this is their last chance. If they can't adapt to your methods, they're gone. Marcus closed the folder and stood up. I'll need access to the advanced training facilities, and I want complete autonomy over their schedule. Done. What's your first move? Marcus smiled, but there was something cold in the expression. I'm going to break them down completely. Then we'll see what's left to build with. That evening, Morrison's crew gathered in the facility's common room to lick their wounds and try to make sense of what had happened to them. The room was designed to simulate a high-end hotel lounge, complete with leather furniture and a well-stocked bar. It was where recruits unwound after particularly brutal training days, and tonight the mood was decidedly somber. We got played, Morrison said, nursing a whiskey that he wasn't really drinking. All that time we spent making fun of the professor, and he was just watching us, learning our patterns, figuring out how to take us apart. Rodriguez was sitting across from him, absently rubbing the spot on his throat where Marcus had pressed the training weapon. Guy moves like a damn ninja. I've never seen anything like it. The question is what we do now, Derek Wilson said. Because I guarantee this isn't over. Guys like Chen don't humiliate people and then just walk away. His twin brother David nodded in agreement. He's got a reputation to maintain now. Every recruit in this place saw what happened today. He can't afford to look weak. Brennan had been unusually quiet since the second engagement ended. The psychological pressure Marcus had applied had affected him more than the others, leaving him with a nervous energy that he was having trouble shaking. What if we're approaching this all wrong? He said suddenly. The others looked at him with surprise. Brennan rarely contributed to tactical discussions, preferring to follow orders rather than formulate plans. Elaborate, Morrison said. Maybe we shouldn't be thinking about this as us versus him. Maybe we should be thinking about what he's trying to teach us. Rodriguez snorted. What he's trying to teach us is that he's better than us. Mission accomplished. No, think about it, Brennan pressed on. He could have embarrassed us in front of everyone and then moved on. Instead, he gave us a second chance. And when that didn't work out, he spent time explaining what we did wrong. That's not the behavior of someone who just wants to prove his superiority. Morrison was staring into his whiskey with growing thoughtfulness. You think he's actually trying to help us? I think he's trying to turn us into something better than we are right now. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a facility orderly carrying an official-looking envelope. Morrison? This is for you. Morrison tore open the envelope and read the contents, his expression growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he looked up at his team with something approaching apprehension. New training schedule. Effective tomorrow, we've been assigned to intensive advanced combat training under the direct supervision of Instructor Chen. 16-hour days, 7 days a week for the next 8 weeks. Son of a bitch, Rodriguez muttered. He's going to try to break us. No, Morrison said, understanding dawning on his face. He's going to succeed in breaking us. The question is whether we're strong enough to put ourselves back together into something better. The next morning arrived with the kind of mountain cold that made breathing painful and turned exhaled air into visible clouds. Marcus was waiting for them at 0500 hours in full combat gear, standing beside a table loaded with equipment that looked far more serious than the training weapons they had been using. "Good morning," he said as Morrison's team assembled in front of him. "Today begins what we're going to call intensive remedial training. Over the next 8 weeks, you're going to learn what it really means to be a private military contractor." He gestured toward the equipment table. "Live ammunition. Live explosives. Live consequences. The training wheels are coming off." Morrison studied Marcus's expression, looking for some hint of what was coming. What he saw was the same calm professionalism Marcus had shown throughout their previous encounters, but underneath that calm was something harder and more dangerous. "Sir," Morrison said, falling back on military courtesy, "what exactly does intensive remedial training involve?" "Everything," Marcus replied. "Combat marksmanship under stress, explosive ordnance disposal, tactical medicine, vehicle operations, close protection protocols, hostage rescue, counter-surveillance, interrogation resistance." He paused to let the implications sink in. "By the time we're finished, you'll either be ready for the kinds of contracts that pay 7 figures per year, or you'll be looking for new careers. There's no middle ground." Rodriguez raised his hand hesitantly. "What's the failure rate for this kind of training?" Marcus's smile was sharp and entirely without warmth. "Historically, about 80%. But then again, most people who attempt it haven't spent the last 6 weeks convincing themselves they already know everything they need to know." The team exchanged glances that spoke of growing apprehension. Yesterday, they had been confident recruits looking forward to lucrative careers in private security. Today, they were facing the possibility that they might not be cut out for this work after all. "First exercise," Marcus announced, picking up what appeared to be a standard assault rifle. "Advanced marksmanship. You'll engage targets at distances from 25 to 400 meters while under physical and psychological stress." He pointed toward an obstacle course that had been set up overnight. It consisted of barriers to climb, trenches to navigate, and sections that would require crawling through simulated rubble. At various points along the course, shooting positions had been established with targets visible at different ranges. Physical stress comes from completing the obstacle course. Psychological stress comes from the timer and the consequences of missing your targets. Morrison studied the course layout with growing concern. What kind of consequences? Miss a target, and your team starts the entire course over from the beginning. Miss 3 targets individually, and you fail the exercise and spend the night in the woods with no equipment. "The night in the woods doesn't sound that bad," Derek Wilson said. Marcus's smile became even sharper. "Did I mention it's supposed to drop below freezing tonight? And that there are mountain lions in these woods? And that you'll be doing it wearing nothing but your physical training uniform?" The silence that followed was profound. Morrison's team was beginning to understand that their intensive remedial training was going to be unlike anything they had experienced in their military careers. Marcus wasn't just going to push them to their limits. He was going to drag them far beyond those limits and force them to find new ones. 3 weeks into Marcus's intensive training program, Morrison's team looked like they had been through a war. Which, in many ways, they had. The obstacle course marksmanship exercise had been just the beginning. Marcus had systematically stripped away every assumption they had about their own capabilities, replacing comfortable confidence with hard-earned competence. They had learned to shoot while exhausted, think while terrified, and function while operating on 3 hours of sleep and nothing but military rations. Rodriguez had lost 25 pounds, transforming his bulky frame into something leaner and more efficient. The Wilson twins had stopped finishing each other's sentences because they had learned to communicate through hand signals and shared glances that conveyed complex tactical information without words. Brennan had discovered that his unsettling smile was actually a valuable psychological weapon when properly deployed. But it was Morrison who had changed the most dramatically. The arrogant young ranger who had dismissed Marcus as a washed-up professor was gone, replaced by a focused leader who understood that real strength came from knowing your limitations as well as your capabilities. The transformation hadn't come easy. Marcus had designed each training exercise to target their specific weaknesses, forcing them to confront the gaps between their self-perception and reality. When Rodriguez relied too heavily on brute force, Marcus put him in scenarios where finesse was the only solution. When the Wilson twins fell back on their telepathic communication, he separated them and forced them to work with strangers. When Brennan tried to intimidate his way through problems, Marcus confronted him with situations where charm and intelligence were the only viable approaches. Morrison had been pushed the hardest, subjected to command scenarios where every decision carried consequences not just for himself but for his entire team. Marcus had taught him that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about making the best decisions possible with incomplete information while maintaining the trust and confidence of the people depending on him. The current exercise was their most challenging yet, a simulated hostage rescue in an urban environment. The hostages were played by other recruits from the facility, and the terrorists were a combination of instructors and advanced students who knew exactly how trained operators would approach the problem. Intel is minimal. Marcus briefed them in the pre-dawn darkness outside a mock city that had been constructed for urban warfare training. Unknown number of hostiles, unknown number of hostages, unknown layout of the building. You have thermal imaging, breaching charges, and a 45-minute time limit before backup arrives and takes over the operation. Morrison studied the building through binoculars, noting entry points, potential sniper positions, and escape routes. It was a 3-story structure designed to simulate a modern office building, complete with multiple stairwells, conference rooms, and a maze of cubicles that could hide threats or hostages. Rules of engagement? Morrison asked. Same as the real world. Positive identification before engagement, minimize collateral damage. Complete mission success means all hostages extracted alive and all hostile threats neutralized. Marcus handed Morrison a tablet displaying the building's basic floor plan. Intel suggests the hostiles are professionals, possibly with military training. Expect coordinated resistance and sophisticated defensive positions. Morrison gathered his team for a quick planning session. The old Morrison would have rushed in with overwhelming force, relying on speed and aggression to carry the day. But 3 weeks of Marcus's training had taught him the value of patience and thorough preparation. 2-team approach, Morrison decided. Derek and Psycho take the main entrance and work up from the ground floor. Tank and David breach from the roof and work down. I'll coordinate from outside until we have better intel on hostile positions. It was a sound tactical decision that balanced speed with security. By attacking from multiple directions, they could prevent hostiles from concentrating their defenses while maintaining flexibility to adapt as the situation developed. "Commo check," Morrison said into his throat mic. "Team 1 ready?" Derek responded. "Team 2 ready," Rodriguez confirmed from his position on the building's roof. Morrison took a deep breath and checked his watch. Execute. The breach was textbook perfect. Derek and Brennan flowed through the main entrance with the kind of smooth coordination that came from weeks of intensive training, while Rodriguez and David fast-roped from the roof into an upper-floor window with precision that would have impressed Marcus's former SEAL teammates. The first floor was a maze of cubicles and conference rooms that provided dozens of potential ambush positions. Derek moved through the space like a predator, weapon ready, every sense focused on detecting threats before they could detect him. Behind him, Brennan covered angles and provided security while maintaining constant communication with the rest of the team. "First floor, southwest quadrant clear," Derek whispered into his mic. "Second floor, east wing clear," Rodriguez reported simultaneously. But the building was too quiet. In a real hostage situation, there would be sounds, crying, shouting, movement from both hostages and hostiles. The silence was ominous and suggested that the opposition was more sophisticated than they had initially assumed. Morrison was monitoring both teams from his command position when his thermal imaging picked up movement in the building's central stairwell, multiple heat signatures moving with purpose and coordination, positioning themselves to intercept his teams from unexpected angles. "All teams, be advised. Multiple contacts moving to intercept you. Unknown number, unknown armament." "Roger that," Derek responded. "Continuing advance." What Morrison's team didn't know was that Marcus had stacked the deck against them in ways that simulated the kind of complex scenario they would face in the real world. The hostiles were a combination of former Special Forces operators and advanced students who had been training for this specific scenario for weeks. They knew the building layout better than Morrison's team, had pre-positioned equipment and weapons, and were operating under rules of engagement that heavily favored the defense. The first contact came when Derek turned a corner and found himself face-to-face with 2 instructors who had been waiting in perfect ambush position. His training kicked in automatically. Threat identification, weapon engagement, tactical movement to cover, but the instructors were ready for him. Simunition rounds caught Derek in the chest and shoulder, marking him as a casualty. Brennan immediately moved to cover his partner, laying down suppressing fire that drove the instructors back into defensive positions, but the damage was done. Team 1 was down by 50% before they had even located the hostages. "Derek is hit," Brennan reported, his voice tight with controlled stress. "Continuing mission." On the second floor, Rodriguez and David were facing their own problems. The upper floors had been turned into a sniper's paradise, with long sightlines and elevated positions that gave defenders significant advantages. David caught a simunition round in the head while crossing an open area, marking him as eliminated. Team 2 down 1 member, Rodriguez reported grimly. Morrison felt the familiar weight of command responsibilities settling on his shoulders. 2 of his 4 men were down, the mission was barely 10 minutes old, and they still hadn't located a single hostage. In his old mindset, he would have ordered an aggressive push to overwhelm the remaining defenders through speed and violence of action. But Marcus had taught him that sometimes the best tactical decision was to step back and reassess. Real private military contractors worked for clients who cared more about mission success than dramatic heroics. Getting hostages killed because of poor tactical decisions was a career-ending mistake. All teams hold position, Morrison ordered, switching to reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. It was a decision that surprised the instructors who were playing the opposition forces. They had expected Morrison to double down on aggression when faced with casualties, falling back on the kind of aggressive tactics that worked in conventional military operations but often failed in the complex scenarios that private contractors faced. Instead, Morrison deployed his remaining team members in overwatch positions and began a methodical intelligence-gathering operation. Using thermal imaging, sound detection, and careful observation, he began building a detailed picture of the defender positions and likely hostage locations. Thermal shows concentrations of people in the northwest corner of the 2nd floor and the central conference room on the 3rd floor, Morrison reported to his team. Based on heat signatures and movement patterns, I'm assessing 8 to 10 hostiles and an unknown number of hostages. Rodriguez had found an elevated position that gave him overwatch on the building's primary stairwell. I can see movement between floors. They're repositioning to counter our advance. Brennan had managed to secure the ground floor and was using his position to monitor elevator shafts and secondary escape routes. Ground floor secured. No movement on primary escape routes. Morrison made a decision that would have been impossible for him 3 weeks earlier. Instead of pressing forward with a depleted team against prepared defenses, he called for backup and shifted to a containment strategy that prioritized hostage safety over speed of execution. Change of mission, he announced. We maintain containment and wait for backup. Priorities preventing hostile escape with hostages. It wasn't the kind of heroic assault that made for exciting training stories, but it was the kind of sound tactical thinking that kept people alive in the real world. Marcus had taught him that successful private contractors were measured not by their body count or their willingness to take risks, but by their ability to complete missions with minimal casualties and maximum client satisfaction. The exercise concluded 40 minutes later when backup arrived in the form of additional instructors who played the role of a secondary assault team. Working together with Morrison's remaining team members, they successfully extracted all hostages and neutralized the remaining hostile forces. But Morrison knew that the real test wasn't the outcome of the exercise. It was how Marcus would evaluate their performance and what lessons he would draw from their tactical decisions. Marcus was waiting for them in the debriefing room with the kind of neutral expression that revealed nothing about his assessment. Morrison's team filed in quietly, still processing the complex emotions that came from a mission that had been both successful and costly. Sit, Marcus said simply. Morrison took his seat at the head of the table with his team arranged around him. The dynamic had shifted over the past 3 weeks. Where once they had been 5 individuals competing for dominance, they had become a genuine team with Morrison as their unquestioned leader. Assessment, Marcus said, looking directly at Morrison. Morrison took a breath and began his analysis. Initial plan was sound given available intelligence. Execution was adequate but not exceptional. Primary failure was insufficient reconnaissance before commitment of forces. Secondary failure was underestimating defender capabilities and preparation. Marcus nodded but said nothing, waiting for Morrison to continue. However, Morrison continued, tactical flexibility allowed us to adapt to changing conditions. Decision to shift from assault to containment prevented additional casualties and maintained mission viability until backup arrived. Rodriguez? Team coordination was good, communication was clear. Individual tactical skills were adequate but not exceptional. Marcus went around the table getting input from each team member about their performance and the lessons they had learned. It was a thorough after-action review that left no aspect of their performance unexamined. Finally, Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied them with the same patient intensity he had shown from their first meeting. 3 weeks ago, this team would have failed this exercise catastrophically, he said finally. You would have taken unnecessary casualties, probably gotten hostages killed, and created an international incident that would have ended your careers. The team exchanged glances, unsure whether this was leading to praise or further criticism. Today, you successfully completed a complex mission against superior forces using tactical judgment and adaptability. More importantly, you made decisions based on mission requirements rather than ego or personal glory. Marcus stood up and walked to the whiteboard, where he began sketching out the tactical situation they had faced. But you're not ready yet. You're thinking like soldiers instead of like contractors. Soldiers fight for causes and countries. Contractors fight for clients and contracts. The motivations are different, and that changes everything about how you approach problems. He turned back to face them with an expression that was somehow both encouraging and ominous. Which is why, for your final exercise, you're going to learn what it means when the client changes the mission parameters in the middle of an operation. The final exercise began at midnight on a Tuesday that would later be remembered as the moment Morrison's team truly understood what they had signed up for. Marcus had given them minimal briefing. Protect a high-value client during transport from the training facility to a secure location 200 miles away. Simple executive protection, the kind of routine contract that made up the bread and butter of private military work. Good money, low risk, straightforward execution. The client was played by Colonel Harrison himself, dressed in an expensive business suit and affecting the mannerisms of a wealthy corporate executive who was used to having other people handle unpleasant details like personal security. Morrison's team had spent the previous week studying his patterns, preferred routes, and security requirements. They had planned meticulously. Rodriguez would drive the armored vehicle, with Morrison riding shotgun for command and control. The Wilson twins would provide close protection for Harrison, maintaining constant physical proximity and monitoring for threats. Brennan would handle technical surveillance and communications, keeping watch on electronic signatures and coordinating with backup teams. It was a textbook protection detail with layers of redundancy and clear protocols for dealing with various threat scenarios. Morrison felt confident that his team was ready for whatever Marcus might throw at them. He was wrong. The first sign that something was off came 30 minutes into the drive, when Harrison's phone rang with what appeared to be an urgent business call. Morrison listened with growing concern as his client discussed what sounded like insider trading violations and potential federal indictments. "Sir," Morrison said during a pause in the conversation, "perhaps you shouldn't be discussing this over an open phone line." Harrison covered the phone and looked at Morrison with the kind of cold arrogance that wealthy people often displayed toward their employees. "I don't pay you to give me advice about my business affairs. I pay you to drive and shoot. Stick to what you know." Morrison felt his jaw clench but remained professionally neutral. "Understood, sir." But the phone conversation continued, and the details becoming increasingly disturbing. Harrison was apparently involved in arms dealing with questionable foreign governments, money laundering through offshore accounts, and business relationships with people who were on various international watch lists. By the time they reached the halfway point of their journey, Morrison was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a protection detail. They were providing security for someone who might be engaged in activities that were not only illegal but potentially treasonous. The second phase of the exercise began when Harrison's phone rang again, this time with news that federal agents were moving to arrest him at his planned destination. The secure location they were heading toward had been compromised, and Harrison was now essentially a fugitive from federal law enforcement. "Change of plans," Harrison announced with the kind of calm that suggested he had been through this before. "We're not going to the original destination. I need you to take me to a private airfield about 50 miles from here. There's a plane waiting that will take me somewhere the federal government can't reach me." Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications. They were no longer providing legitimate executive protection. They were helping a criminal escape justice. The legal and ethical ramifications were staggering. "Sir, I need to clarify something," Morrison said carefully. "Are you asking us to assist you in evading federal law enforcement?" Harrison's expression turned cold and dangerous. "I'm telling you to complete the contract you were paid to fulfill. My security and transportation to a safe location. Everything else is irrelevant." Morrison pulled the vehicle over to the side of the road and turned to face his client directly. "With respect, sir, assisting a fugitive in evading federal authorities is a federal crime. We could be looking at charges of obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting, and conspiracy. You could be looking at breach of contract and violation of non-disclosure agreements that would ruin your careers and leave you financially destroyed," Harrison replied smoothly. "Plus, I should mention that I have video evidence of some of your extracurricular activities during training that could be very embarrassing if it found its way to the wrong people." It was blackmail, pure and simple. Morrison felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm and think through the situation tactically. This was exactly the kind of complex scenario that Marcus had been preparing them for. A situation where the legal, ethical, and practical considerations were all pulling in different directions. Behind him, Morrison could hear his team members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They were all experiencing the same realization: the comfortable world of military service, where orders came from legitimate authority and the mission objectives were clear, had been replaced by the murky world of private contracting, where clients might be criminals and contracts might conflict with the law. "Team leaders call," Rodriguez said quietly from the driver's seat. Morrison looked at each of his team members in turn, seeing his own confusion and concern reflected in their expressions. 3 months ago, they would have either followed orders without question or abandoned the mission entirely. But Marcus's training had taught them to think beyond simple binary choices. "Derek, what's our legal exposure if we complete this mission as modified?" Morrison asked. Derek Wilson had been studying contract law during his free time, part of Marcus's insistence that modern contractors needed to understand the legal framework they operated within. "Potentially severe. Aiding a fugitive is a federal felony, but abandoning a client in a dangerous situation could expose us to civil liability and breach of contract claims." "David, tactical assessment of our current situation?" David Wilson scanned the road around them with professional paranoia. "Exposed position, limited escape routes, unknown surveillance situation. If federal agents are really moving to arrest our client, this area could be swarming with law enforcement within hours." "Brennan, communications analysis?" Brennan had been monitoring electronic signatures throughout the journey. Multiple encrypted communications in the area consistent with federal law enforcement operations. Also picking up what might be surveillance aircraft. "Tank, what's your gut telling you?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment before responding. "This feels like a test, boss. The kind of scenario where there's no clean answer and we have to choose between bad options." Morrison nodded, appreciating his team's thoughtful analysis. They had moved far beyond the impulsive decision-making that had characterized their early training. But that didn't make the current choice any easier. "Sir," Morrison said, turning back to Harrison, "I'm going to present you with what we call a tactical alternative." Harrison raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. "We complete our original contract by ensuring your safety and security, but instead of helping you evade federal authorities, we escort you to a lawyer who can represent your interests through proper legal channels. That's not what I'm paying you for. With respect, sir, it's exactly what you're paying us for: personal protection and security consultation. Running from federal charges will only make your legal situation worse and could result in additional charges. The smart play is to deal with this situation through legitimate channels." It was a masterful piece of tactical thinking that satisfied multiple objectives simultaneously. They could fulfill their contractual obligations without becoming accessories to federal crimes, protect their clients' long-term interests even if he couldn't see it in the moment, and maintain their professional integrity. Harrison stared at Morrison for a long moment, and then his expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. "Interesting approach, Morrison. Most contractors would have either followed orders blindly or abandoned the mission entirely." Morrison felt a chill of understanding. This was a test. "Everything has been a test," a new voice said from the vehicle's rear compartment. Morrison spun around to find Marcus emerging from what had appeared to be empty cargo space. He had been concealed in the vehicle throughout the entire journey, monitoring their responses to the evolving scenario. The arms dealing, the federal charges, the blackmail, all scripted scenarios designed to test your decision-making under pressure. Marcus continued. "The question was whether you would think like soldiers following orders or like professional contractors managing complex situations." Harrison's business suit and corporate demeanor melted away as he resumed his familiar role as commanding officer. "Final exercise evaluation. Your team demonstrated tactical flexibility, legal awareness, and ethical reasoning under pressure. Most importantly, you found a solution that served your client's real interests rather than his immediate demands." Morrison felt his team relaxing around him as the implications sank in. They had passed their final test, but more than that, they had demonstrated genuine growth from the arrogant recruits they had been 3 months earlier. However, Marcus continued, this was still a simulation. Real private military contracting presents scenarios that are far more complex and dangerous than anything we can safely replicate in training. He handed Morrison a tablet displaying what appeared to be actual contract offers from legitimate private military firms. The pay scales were impressive. Some contracts offered more money for 6 months of work than most people earned in several years. These are real opportunities for graduates of this program. Executive protection for Fortune 500 CEOs in high-risk environments. Security consultation for humanitarian organizations in conflict zones. Asset recovery in countries where official law enforcement can't operate. Morrison scanned the contract descriptions with growing excitement and apprehension. This was what they had been training for, the chance to apply their skills in situations that mattered, with compensation that reflected the risks involved. But understand, Marcus continued, the clients won't always be noble. The missions won't always have clear moral parameters, and the choices you make will have consequences that extend far beyond your immediate team. He gestured toward the tablet Morrison was holding. These contracts represent opportunities to serve corporate interests, national security objectives, and humanitarian causes. But they also represent opportunities to become involved in activities that could compromise your integrity, violate your principles, or endanger innocent people. Morrison looked up from the tablet to meet Marcus's steady gaze. How do we know which contracts to accept? By remembering everything you've learned over the past 3 months. Technical skills will keep you alive, but moral clarity will keep you human. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew 5 envelopes, each bearing the name of one of Morrison's team members. Inside these envelopes are your graduation certificates and recommendations for placement with private military firms. You've earned them through dedication, growth, and a willingness to be honest about your own limitations. Morrison accepted his envelope with something approaching reverence. 3 months ago, he had been a cocky ex-soldier who thought his military record entitled him to success in the private sector. Now he understood that his military service had been just the beginning of his education in what it meant to be a professional operator. There's one more thing, Marcus said, as the team prepared to return to the facility. Morrison, I want to speak with you privately. The others headed back toward the main building while Morrison remained with Marcus beside the training vehicle. The conversation that followed would set the trajectory for Morrison's career and his understanding of what Marcus had been trying to teach them all along. You've shown exceptional leadership potential, Marcus began. Not just tactical competence, but the kind of moral reasoning that separates good operators from great ones. Morrison felt a flush of pride that he tried to keep from showing on his face. Praise from Marcus had become something valuable over the past 3 months. I'm recommending you for a special opportunity, Marcus continued, handing Morrison a business card that contained nothing but a phone number and an address. There's a private military firm that specializes in the kinds of contracts that require both tactical excellence and ethical flexibility. They're looking for team leaders who can operate in complex environments where the mission parameters are constantly changing. Morrison studied the card with growing interest. What kind of work? The kind that governments can't acknowledge and corporations can't officially sanction. Hostage rescue in countries where official military intervention would cause international incidents. Asset recovery in war zones where conventional law enforcement has collapsed. Protection for journalists and aid workers in places where being an American can get you killed. It sounded like exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful work that Morrison had dreamed of when he first entered the private military field. But Marcus's expression suggested there were complications he hadn't mentioned yet. The pay is exceptional, but the risks are proportional. Success in this line of work requires not just tactical competence, but the kind of judgment that comes from understanding the bigger picture of international relations, corporate politics, and human nature. Marcus paused and looked directly into Morrison's eyes. Most importantly, it requires operators who can maintain their integrity even when clients pressure them to compromise it. Morrison thought back to the exercise they had just completed, where Harrison had tried to pressure them into helping him evade federal authorities. The parallels were obvious. Real clients would present real moral dilemmas that wouldn't have clean solutions. Are you offering me this opportunity? I'm offering you the chance to earn it. Contact that number, mention my name, and they'll arrange an interview. But understand, if you take this path, the easy assignments are over. Every mission will test not just your tactical skills, but your character. Morrison slipped the card into his pocket with the sense that he was crossing a threshold he couldn't uncross. 3 months ago, he had been looking for a lucrative career that would leverage his military training. Now he was being offered the chance to do work that actually mattered, even if it came with risks and moral complexities he was only beginning to understand. Thank you, sir, for everything. Marcus nodded and turned to walk back toward the facility. Don't thank me yet, Morrison. Thank me when you've completed your first real mission and can still look yourself in the mirror. As Morrison watched his instructor disappear into the building, he realized that his education was far from over. Marcus had taught him the fundamentals, but the real lessons would come from applying those fundamentals in a world where the stakes were measured not in training scores but in human lives. Behind him, his team was waiting with expressions that mixed excitement, apprehension, and the kind of bond that came from shared hardship and mutual respect. They had started as 5 arrogant individuals who thought they knew everything about being warriors. They were ending as a professional team that understood the difference between fighting and serving a cause larger than themselves. The mocking and attacking had stopped weeks ago. In its place was something far more valuable, the respect that came from recognizing genuine competence and moral courage. Marcus Chen had turned the tables not through violence or intimidation, but through the simple act of demanding excellence and refusing to accept anything less. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all.